Transfiguration story comes from Luke, the 9th chapter. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and went up the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwelling places, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was still saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent in those days and told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met them. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to the Lord Christ.
I invite you to be seated. Up on a high mountain, Jesus had taken Peter and John and James, and they saw that Jesus had been changed. His face started to glow, his clothes became dazzling white, and then there was with him Moses and Elijah, and they too were in glory. They were shining as well as Jesus was shining. And they were talking with Jesus about his departure, about his exodus, about his death, his resurrection, and his ascension, and the coming of the Holy Spirit. The things that Luke in his gospel makes absolutely sure that we know are God's doings, are God's way of showing us love. And in the midst of this incredible event, there were 3 witnesses, Peter and John and James. And of course we know the story, we've heard it, we hear it every year from one of the different Gospels, and we always hear that Peter is being Peter. That he wants to build 3 shelters, booths or tents or something. We're not sure what he wants to build, but he wants to build 3 shelters. One for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. By the way, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Did they have photographic pictures of them, paintings of them? Maybe they had name tags on. I don't know. How did they know that it was Moses and Elijah? What's that? Facebook. They knew them from Facebook. That's it. So Peter was being Peter. He was being impulsive like Peter normally is. And wanting to do the right thing, but not always knowing what that right thing is. And he wants to jump in and be active and do something. And he doesn't want this moment to go away. He doesn't want Jesus to change back to the regular-looking Jesus. He doesn't want Moses and Elijah to disappear. He wants to keep things as they are.
Food in the oven.
And a cloud comes over them, and for some reason it's not just a regular cloud, because it says they were terrified. If it was a regular cloud, they wouldn't have been terrified. But the cloud comes and they are terrified, and they hear the voice. The same voice that came when Jesus was baptized. When Jesus was baptized, the voice talked right to Jesus. In some of the Gospels, other people hear the voice, and in some of the Gospels, only Jesus hears the voice. But the voice in baptism talks right to Jesus. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. A little bit different this time. The voice is directed at the apostles, at Peter and John and James. And the voice says, this is my Son, the chosen one. Listen to him. An incredible event. You would have thought that the disciples would have been out of their mind in just the glory, and they wouldn't be able to contain their joy and their amazement. And yet, the gospel tells us that when they got down the mountain, that they said nothing. The disciples didn't tell anybody about what happened up there, and Jesus surely didn't tell anybody about what happened up on the mountain. So it was one of those God things that happened, and yet who is going to find out if they don't tell? And for some reason, they decide to keep it to themselves for however long. Obviously, they got it written down in the Gospel so that we have it, so they told at some point. But if you listen in the Gospel reading to the second half of the story, the next day they come down the mountain and they're met by a great crowd of people. And I wonder how long Peter and John and James were up on the mountain, at least a day, and there's a great crowd waiting. What had that crowd been doing? What had the other disciples been doing? Jesus in the past had given them the calling, given them the power, given them the authority to cast out demons, to heal people. So maybe they were going around in the crowd and taking care of people, casting out demons, healing people, probably telling Jesus stories. So the crowd was upbeat and waiting for Jesus and Peter and James and John to come down the mountain. And when they got there, there was a man. There was a man in distress, a man desperate, who calls out to Jesus, Lord, look at my son. I need your help. There's no place else to turn. I beg you. I beg you. Imagine his desperation. Imagine his anguish, his only son. He shrieks, he convulses, he foams at the mouth, he's thrown to the ground. He begged Jesus' disciples to cure him, to heal him, to cast out the unclean spirit, and yet they could not. But Jesus takes the boy and casts out the unclean spirit and gives him back to his Father. And here's the key words. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. Jesus had just been up on the mountain and been changed. His face was white as snow. His clothes were so white they could hardly stand it. He was there with Moses and Elijah, the giver of the law and the great prophet, the ones who were said to have to come back before Jesus, before the Messiah would come. And there was Jesus talking to them. And yet that's not what astounded the crowd. That's not what brought about the recognition of the greatness of God. The curing, the healing, the casting out for one little boy energized the whole crowd to recognize the greatness of God. So what about today? When and where are we astounded by the greatness of God? How many of us have seen Jesus and Moses and Elijah when they go up a mountain in all their glory? Nobody raising their hand? Yeah. Didn't think so. But we see and so often don't recognize the greatness of God. If we had a child or a grandchild with the same symptoms that this little boy in the story had, what would we do? We'd take him to the doctor, right? Get him some anti-seizure medicines, and he'd probably be okay. But they didn't have anti-seizure medications then. But if we went to the doctor with our child or grandchild and got the anti-seizure medicine and all was well, would we be astounded at the greatness of God? We should be. We should look at something like that and say, thank you, God. For in all your glory you work through people, through ordinary and extraordinary people, through doctors and scientists and nurses and technicians and caregivers to bring about wholeness. That is where we should be astounded. God works through people. We need to see Jesus and Moses and Elijah and all their glory to be astounded by God's greatness. Let's make a special effort this week. Let's look for God's greatness around us. Let's look for what's happening in our lives or somebody else's lives and be able to put a finger on it and say, that is God at work. And to give thanks for it. And to tell somebody about it. I'd love to hear your stories of where you see God at work this week. So call me, text me, email me, use a tin can with a string, whatever technique you want to use. Let me know where you see God at work this week. Where do we notice the greatness of God? My guess it won't be in Jesus and Elijah and Moses in all their glory, but it will be the greatness of God. God is doing great things in our lives and in the lives of those around us. All we need to do is open our hearts and minds and see it and recognize it and name it for what it is. Let's be astounded this week. Let's look for God's greatness and be in God's presence all week. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand and sing together.